Hi everyone, good morning. I hope you're all feeling well rested and inspired after a really great day of discussion yesterday. Um, it's a real honour and pleasure for me to be here moderating the first session of today, which is on making the women's game accessible and is a topic that's really close to my heart. My name's Esther Jones Russell. I am 28. I have dark brown hair that is currently up in a ponytail. I'm wearing glasses and I'm sat in front of a window with some slightly garish yellow curtains, which I can only apologise for. And my pronouns are she, her. Um, I work as the head of policy and social inclusion at the FAIR Network. So we work internationally to tackle discrimination in football and use the sport for social change. A large part of my work is looking at women's football and fighting for gender equality. And before that, I actually worked at CAFE, where I worked on a lot of our global projects to improve access and inclusion for disabled people, including at the World Cup in Russia in 2018. And I was at the third International Cafe Conference in Bilbao that same year. So it's really exciting for me to be back this year and hosting this really brilliant panel. So yeah, I just want to say a huge congratulations to the Cafe team for putting on another great event. I'm sure we're all aware over the last few years of the incredible growth that the women's game has seen. The World Cup in France in 2019 saw unprecedented media attention. Women's footballers are becoming household names. They're getting incredible sponsorship deals and becoming part of global marketing campaigns. The game's being professionalized. Women footballers are being taken more seriously as athletes. They're gaining legitimacy and they're getting better workers' rights as a result. And at a grassroots level, we're seeing more women and girls playing football than ever before. So this period of growth and development is an incredibly exciting opportunity to embed the rights of disabled people into the core structures of the game. And it's why I'm so excited to have the panelists that we have who will be able to tell us more about how this is already being achieved and what more still needs to come. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Laura Gutierrez, who is a former professional player at Barcelona, Levante, and the Spanish national team. And I'm sure she is still celebrating from Barcelona's brilliant performance last night to beat Arsenal. She is now CAFE's first female ambassador and also works at the Levante Community Foundation, where she leads on the social inclusion projects for disabled people. Thank you very much for joining us, Laura. We also have V Blackwood, who is joining us on their Friday night. So thank you for spending your weekend with us. V is in New Zealand, where they are the Senior Human Rights Advisor at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. I'm sure we're all aware that in 2023, New Zealand and Australia will jointly host the Women's World Cup, and we're all looking forward to it. And V worked on the human rights risk assessment ahead of that tournament. So they'll be talking us through how access and inclusion is built into those considerations and into that assessment. And last, but by no means least, we have the wonderful Bas Vos, who is a self-professed fanatic football fan and following Feyenoord, the Dutch national team, and Bayern Munich. I think you visited, Bas, 400 matches in over 100 stadiums and 20 countries.
No, I believe it is 381 among 90 grounds, 381 games in 23 national associations.
Okay, not quite 400, still pretty impressive.
Not far off.
So yeah, Bas will be talking to us about his experiences attending women's football matches. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Before I hand over to Bas, who will kick us off with his presentation, I just want to remind you that after the presentations, there will be a Q&A session. So please do put in any questions you have into the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter.
Oh, wait. Yeah, the presentation isn't yet on screen, so I was like waiting for that. Well, first of all, thanks to CAFE for having me here in this conference. As what you were already told, my name is Bas. My pronouns are he and him, and to describe myself, I have an orange kit. Actually, it's the Netherlands national kit. And I'm sitting in a wheelchair, although you can't see that now because I'm sitting on my desk chair. My presentation goes about attending women's football games as a disabled fan, and then emphasize the difference to for the men's. If we can go to the next slide. Well, we had already the biggest points in this introduction covered, but I'm 28 years old, and I live in a village between The Hague and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. My first football game was at 7 years old. The first women's game I attended was in 2016, and there is many more to come. The picture you see there was taken at the UEFA Euro 2020 at the game where we got eliminated against Czechia, because there are free assurances alive. You die, you pay taxes, and the Netherlands has a difficult time against Czechia. Women's football, my own domestic club, my favorite domestic club, started in the women's Eredivisie this season. I visited 2 games myself, and we won both games. We are actually doing a very good job, despite it being our debut season. So that's really impressive, and I didn't expect it as well. The info you need, well, basically, you need, of course, to know where the ground is, exactly where the game is played. Thankfully, the Royal Dutch Football Association has a football app where every game in the country is covered in, no matter if it is the Eredivisie or the second team of the under-7s, whose seniors team is playing in like the 10th or 11th tier. And it also has the address of the ground. So basically, if you tap that address, you get a link to Google Maps, and then you can plan your travel through public transport very easily. So that's also how to find the games. Now, I would happily take you all through the rules and regulations compared to men's football in terms of stadium infrastructure, etc., etc. But I was unable to find it. So that's pretty disappointing. If we can go to the next slide, please. My adventures with the national team in women's football. I visited 12 games so far, including UEFA Women's Euro 2017 and the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2019. Well, as the Euros in 2017 was playing in my country, we were the host nation. That was very easy to attend to. But the Women's World Cup, the most tricky thing to arrange for that was transportation, because the games I went to were in Valenciennes, Reims, and Lyon. Well, Valenciennes is close to the Netherlands. However, it's not quite a big city where a major train station is. So I used special football buses arranged by the Royal Dutch Football Association. Same I did was in Reims. Yeah, that was very easy. The coaches were not wheelchair accessible. However, that's not very much a problem for me because I'm very strong, so I can easily climb out of my chair and into the bus. And my wheelchair is very light, so that's basically then for the cargo. And I already also have tickets for the Women's Euro next year, where indeed transportation is the trickiest thing again. However, I will only have tickets for 1 game in Sheffield and 1 possible game in London. Well, if the game in London goes ahead, then I'll simply use the Eurostar. Now, the transportation at the Women's World Cup, to get back to on that too, I also have a good story, but given the time, I will let that slide. If we can go to the next slide, please. Is women's football more inclusive and welcoming? Well, we still have a lot of work to do. However, we do see work in progress. The Women's Euro tickets are now being sold centralized through the UEFA ticket portal, which was not the case 4 years ago, because if I remember correctly, back then the games were sold through the website of the organization committee. Getting women's club and national team tickets, whether it being home or away, is just as easy as getting men's national team tickets or men's club tickets, as it is the case here. So yeah, we do see the work in progress, but we always have work to do. The work never stops. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I would like to show you my pictures that I've taken with my adventures so far. At the top left, we see the Dutch team celebrating the win at the European Championships in 2017. We also see the picture taken at the top center in Valenciennes, top right in Reims. Down at the left, we see my tickets for the Women's World Cup final, which we lost against Team USA. Down at the center, we see the ground being ready for the final. And down at the right, we see the Dutch team with the king and 2 of his 3 daughters who attended the game. So they do see women's football as equal as men's football. If we can go to the next slide, please. That is the banner that Feyenoord fans have put up for the first women's game against Ajax, which was almost 100 years exactly after the first men's game against Ajax. To go back in history, the first men's game we drew 2-2, and the first women's game we won 4-2. We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, the source as well. The statistics, I don't have out of my head, but I use a full app to track that. Stories, well, the source, of course, is obviously my memory, and the pictures are made by myself and either the Royal Dutch Football Association or the Royal House in terms of part 1. And Jim Bremer made it a picture on part 2 of the pictures. So I believe that's already the end of my presentation. Is there a next slide? No, there is not.
Yeah, thanks.
So thank you very much. So I'll hand over back to Esther.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Baz. And I know how important the matchday feedback you provide from all the games you go to is to Cafe and the work they do. So it's great to hear more about that. And I am sure you're looking forward to the Euros next year, where the Netherlands are bound to be one of the favourites. I'm kind of hoping for an England-Netherlands final, maybe. We'll see.
That would be fun.
Yeah, thank you. And now, we've heard the fan perspective of attending these major tournaments. So now we're going to go to hear from the organisers' perspective. So I'm very, very pleased to hand over to V, who will share how they've worked in the preparation building up to the 2023 Women's World Cup. Over to you, V.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I'll just speak very briefly in Te Reo Māori, which is the Indigenous language of New Zealand, to introduce myself. No ingarangi o kutipuna, ko ruapehu te maunga te rū nei taku ngākau, ko whanganui te awa e mahia nei aku mā harahara, I tipu ake au ki whanganui, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o te whanganui ātara e noho nehe nei au. Ko V Blackwood toku ingoa. Hi, I'm V Blackwood. I have blonde hair and I'm wearing glasses and a black top. I'm calling, as Esther said, in from New Zealand, where it is Friday night here. In the Māori language, I just acknowledged the mountain and the rivers of the Indigenous people where I grew up and the city where I'm now living, and the Indigenous people who have tribal authority over the areas where I'm living. So, as Esther's already introduced, I work at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. If you could move to the next slide, please. The New Zealand Human Rights Commission is Aotearoa New Zealand's national human rights institution. So we've got A accreditation under the Paris Principles. Our commission includes a Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesorero NZM. Paula also holds the portfolio for sport and human rights. And the reason that Paula holds that portfolio is that she is a former Olympian herself in high performance cycling. And at the Tokyo Paralympics earlier this year, was immensely lucky to be able to accompany the New Zealand Paralympics team as the chef de mission for the Paralympics. So when New Zealand and Australia were lucky enough to win the co-hosting bid for the Women's World Cup 2023, and FIFA approached us about the question of carrying out a human rights risk assessment. Very naturally, that sat in Paula's portfolio. I, unlike Paula, and unlike others, I'm sure, was not a football fan, although I have watched football matches in the past. That said, I put my hand up because I thought that this was a really great opportunity to explore the area of sport and human rights in a way that I don't think that has been done, at least in New Zealand in the past. If you could move to the next slide, please. So the question here is, what is a human rights risk assessment? Sporting events, and especially mega sporting events, have huge opportunities, but they also come with huge risks across a range of areas. And those risks include human rights risks. But sporting events, if they're carried out well, can promote and protect human rights and inclusivity. But to FIFA, it was very important, in line with its stated commitment to human rights, to partner with both New Zealand Human Rights Commission and the Australian Human Rights Commission to conduct an independent human rights risk assessment. The objective of our risk assessment is to identify and prioritise with stakeholders, so with players, with the player entourages, with workers that support the event, with fans, spectators, families, and communities, to identify human rights related concerns that need to be addressed as part of FIFA's planning for the tournament, and then to make recommendations back to FIFA, both about the risks that we've found and, where possible, the ways that those risks can be mitigated, or the legacy opportunities that are evolving. If we could move to the next slide, please. The human rights risk assessment considered both risks and opportunities. So we didn't hold ourselves back to only looking at the negatives. We also asked stakeholders what they could see as positive opportunities, particularly if they were folded in early enough at the planning processes, that would help to deliver both a more inclusive and human rights honouring tournament, and also continue to deliver on the opportunities and the legacy left behind in both countries after the tournament has been delivered. The risk assessment is carried out according to the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which has 31 principles, but a 3-pillar protect, respect, and remedy framework. And so those pillars include the state duty to protect against human rights harms, including by businesses, the business responsibility to respect human rights, and the need to ensure that there is access to remedy for any business-related human rights harms. In New Zealand, of course, the New Zealand government is already working very closely with FIFA as it begins to deliver to plan the tournament. So it was a very natural way of working, and it was a very constructive relationship. It was a really enjoyable process to undertake. Could you move to the next slide, please? The way that we identified potential risks and issues was through consultation with a wide range of stakeholders. We did carry out desk-based research to begin with, but we then spent time talking with players, coaches, support staff, team entourages, workers and volunteers, and that includes both workers that are directly associated with the tournament or workers who work in stadium support, including in hospitality, and also workers who will be working in the cities where the tournament matches are being held. And we spoke with spectators and local communities, including disabled communities and LGBTQI communities here in New Zealand. One of our focus areas was absolutely on accessibility and on the rights of disabled people to participate fully and equally. That's a very natural fit, of course, for Paula as the Disability Rights Commissioner, but it was also a key risk that we identified very early on, that through poor planning, disabled fans can be very shut out of tournaments as full spectators and to be able to participate fully. If you could move to the next slide, please. We found, of course, referring to this slide and my previous comment, that the accessibility was a key risk. This includes the accessibility of the infrastructure and the services at stadiums. None of the stadiums that will be used in the 2023 tournament are being built for the tournament, in contrast to the stadiums that are being custom built in Qatar. And so all of the stadiums, if they are not up to standard for disabled access, will require retrofitting to be able to make them more accessible. We also looked at accessibility in terms of transport. As Bas just mentioned, the tour bus wasn't accessible for him. He wasn't able to get on it using his wheelchair. The tourism infrastructure in both countries is a key issue, as well as public buildings and other spaces in host countries. Before I move to what stakeholders told us, I just wanted to give a little illustration of how we did that conversation with stakeholders. We had wanted to do face-to-face roundtables across the country so that we could sit down and talk directly with people. Unfortunately, just as we were planning that, and about 3 weeks away from going into that process, our colleagues across the ditch in Australia all went into lockdown for COVID, and so they were confined to their houses, working through Zoom. We said in New Zealand, well, let's match what they're doing. If they're having to do roundtables over Zoom, we'll do the same thing so that it's consistent across the risk assessment for both of us. About a week before we then were due in New Zealand to start our roundtables, we also went into a COVID lockdown. And the COVID lockdown here in New Zealand was very severe. It involved essentially shutdown of the vast majority of public places, of workplaces, which meant that everyone had to participate over the internet, over Zoom, which in itself can create accessibility issues. I also want to note as well that many of the disabled people's organisations that we had hoped to be able to have conversation with had to send us very apologetic messages at the last minute, saying that they were inundated with work to deal with supporting their people or their communities in this unexpected snap lockdown. So that was just another fun aspect of it, and it was quite bizarre, I would say, to be in the middle of a COVID lockdown talking about a mega sporting event that will bring 20,000 people from around the world to Aotearoa in 2 years' time, while at the time we were hardly able to leave our houses or to go out and about. If we could move to the next slide, please. What our stakeholders told us in our disability sessions were issues including inaccessible communications, such as easy read materials, sign language and captioning or closed captioning. We heard a lot about inequitable access to ticketing, and that included the fact that many disabled people have lower incomes than non-disabled people. That's particularly the case here in New Zealand. And so if tickets were priced accessibly at the same price across the board, that would shut a lot of disabled people out of being able to fully participate. Whereas if there were subsidized ticket prices available, that would make it a lot more accessible for members of our community on lower incomes. We heard about inequitable allocation of accessible seating, including that accessible seating, so seating that facilitates a wheelchair or facilitates a guide dog or other physical needs, then had worse sight lines. It was blocked by pillars. You couldn't see the field properly. We heard about the lack of appropriate access to venues and facilities, including in the last mile. So even if people have travel supported from home to door, the last mile getting into the stadium was often an issue. We heard about issues for people with auditory sensitivities, that obviously in a huge stadium where everyone is so excited, it can be a very loud and overwhelming place. And for people with auditory sensitivities, whether that's due to issues such as autism spectrum or other issues where they need a quiet place to go and regroup, that wasn't available. We heard about lack of access to volunteering opportunities, and that particularly included paid volunteering opportunities where people can benefit financially as well as enjoy the experience of participating as a volunteer. We heard a real message about lack of engagement with people and organisations with lived experience of disability in the planning process, that the planning is done with the best intentions, but nobody actually consults with the people who have the lived experience and can tell you, actually, this doesn't meet the needs of the diverse range of people with disabilities that you're trying to support. And we heard about inadequate accessible transport. We could move to the next slide, please. We also identified really significant opportunities for inclusion. As I already mentioned, the stadiums need to be retrofitted if they're going to be updated for better accessibility standards. Because of the ongoing COVID outbreak, FIFA weren't able to inspect the stadiums before awarding the bid in the way that they would normally do. What they did instead was visit Australia and New Zealand after the bid had already been won and inspected every stadium that is likely to have a football tournament match held there. And they identified a range of areas for all of those stadiums that retrofitting will need to be carried out. The stadiums, by and large, they found were relatively good, but not at the level of accessibility that FIFA was expecting, which is the highest possible level of accessibility for stadiums. So they've now mandated that all of our stadiums in Australia and New Zealand must be updated to meet those higher accessibility requirements. So there's a huge program of retrofitting going on at present. What that means is it'll really leave a legacy for disabled fans here in New Zealand and Australia long after the FIFA tournament finishes. And my colleague Martine, who is one of our disability advisors and who is blind and uses a guide dog, expressed her excitement. She said to me, I've never been a football fan either, but with these new accessibility standards, who knows, maybe it'll be the final thing that tips me over into getting into it. If you could move to the next slide, please. Once we had carried out the assessment and assessed all of the information that we'd been told and grouped it into theme. We then put forward a range of recommendations to FIFA to ensure accessibility. I've just drawn out the recommendations here that relate to accessibility. We recommended that they should work with ticketing third parties to ensure accessible ticket access. So if they're using third-party web designers or ticket sellers, they should work with them to ensure that the ticket sale has accessible options. They should undertake continued accessibility audits of the stadiums once that retrofitting has been done. They should promote communications and technology in support of the tournament, including Easy Read, New Zealand Sign Language and Australian Sign Language, Braille and large print. They should include targets for diverse representation in volunteer roles, including opportunities for disabled volunteers. They should include para-football games as part of the tournament broader events, so as part of fan fest events and other celebrations of the tournament. And they should create a legacy program for para-football for disabled women and girls, both here in New Zealand and in Australia. We could move to the final slide, please. This slide, I have to confess, is no longer quite accurate. I prepared it last week on the basis that my assumption was that the report would be published yesterday, the 9th of December. That publication has actually been delayed, but I expect that it will be published next week. So once it is published, then you are very welcome to go and read the final published document and hear more about what we said. Now that it has been provided back to FIFA and will then be published, the role now sits with FIFA to consider the report and consider our recommendations as it further plans the tournament. So although we made these recommendations because we are the independent human rights institutions, we aren't working directly with FIFA at this stage, and we don't have the mandated power to force them to take any of the recommendations. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, the relationship that we have had and the feedback that we have had from FIFA has been incredibly encouraging. It's been a really exciting risk assessment to carry out, and I think it's quite groundbreaking, really, at least here in New Zealand, for us to undertake a risk assessment of this kind that so explicitly accounts for accessible access to sports. I'd be really excited to see other major sporting bodies pick up this kind of risk assessment in the future for other huge tournaments that are planned, whether here in New Zealand, in Australia, or elsewhere across the world. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vi. It's really, really great to hear about the work that's going on behind the scenes, and particularly to hear about how you're working directly with disabled people to amplify their voices and make sure they're involved in all of these conversations. So thank you very much. Just a reminder that we will have a bit of time for some questions at the end, so put in any questions you might have into the chat box. And now I'm really pleased to hand over to our final presenter, Laura Gutierrez, who since retiring in 2020 has been championing disabled people's rights across football. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you. Good day, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the entire CAFE team to invite me for this International CAFE conference. I'm delighted to be today with all of you to speak about football and how we can use it as a tool to generate change in our society. Next slide, please. To start, I want to talk shortly about myself. I have been a professional football player for 10 years at Football Club Barcelona and Levante. And I managed also to play for the Spanish national team. With 26 years, I decided to retire from professional football to dedicate myself to a new role, which I still have today. I am currently working for the Levante Foundation. I am responsible for the area of social integration. My main function is to coordinate Levante EDI for children and Women Levante EDI. EDI stands for Football School for Intellectual Disabled People. At the same time, I am also the coach of both teams. I recently also became CAFE ambassador. I am really full of joy to take on the role, and I hope I will be it for a long time. For me, studying has also been important for me. I am senior technician in physical and sports activities. I am senior technician in social integration. And now I am studying the university career of social education. The next slide, please. As a previous professional football player, for me, the fans have always been a very important part of the team and the club. Today, I would like to talk about accessibility of women football pitches and stadiums. I believe there is not much difference comparing it to men's football. There are many barriers for disabled people who wish to assist to games in stadiums. For example, a person with limited mobility often cannot choose the area of the stadium where they want to sit. They are often limited to zones next to the pitch, which often has a bad view of the pitch. And as I say, they often do not have possibility to choose the location where they want to be at the stadium. This is still very common. With regards to non-visibly disabled fans, they are even not considered in the prevent organization. There is still a lot of work to do in the area of accessibility until this is really accomplished in football clubs. And I always say everyone has the right to enjoy football regardless of the characteristics and needs they present. The next slide, please. 2 years ago, with 26 years and after 10 years as a professional player, I took one of the most important decisions of my life. I finished my career as a player and started my career as a coach for disabled people. I was very convinced about the decision, and today I'm very happy. The Levante Foundation is very much linked to disabled people and sports. They have 4 sections of adapted sports. Levante EDI, which is a football team for people with intellectually or learning disabled people. Levante PC, which is a football team for persons with cerebral palsy. Levante Masclets, which is a hockey team for electrical wheelchair users, and a table tennis team for disabled people. In addition to those different sports teams and sessions, we also have the project Discapacidad, which aims to give awareness sessions and classes to schools. Those lessons are given by our Paralympic athletes, Ricardo Ten, David Casinos, and Monica Merenciano. Moreover, we have health habits projects and social integration projects for children which experience social exclusion. The next slide, please. 4 months ago, I obtained the opportunity to become a CAFE ambassador. This was one of the best proposals I have received in my life. It really encourages me and makes me happy. You are asking yourself why? Because CAFE is an organization which works on improving accessibility and inclusion for disabled people within football across Europe. This really fits my current job and my ambitions. Both CAFE and Levante Foundation have a similar vision. They work to improve inclusion of disabled people with the help of sports, want to take away prejudices and normalize the topic of disability, fight for equal opportunities, and work to take away barriers. I am really happy to have the link between Levante Foundation and CAFE. Jointly, we can improve the conditions for disabled people. Hopefully, in the near future, they can enjoy the same rights as everybody else. And finally, next slide, please. That's it with my presentation. That's for your attention, and congratulations to CAFE for hosting this event. They are so important during those times. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. That was really interesting. I wanted to bring Baz back in briefly to ask, because I think you highlighted a really common complaint in women's football, that there's a lack of information available, whether it's finding out the results or the team sheets or accessibility information. On the other hand, there's kind of more of a community feeling. So players are more accessible, clubs are more accessible. I wondered if you've noticed a difference in the communication channels between disabled fans and clubs in the women's game compared to the men's game.
That's a tough question, but as far as I can think of real quick right now, there isn't any significant difference. My club has different social media channels for its men's and women's team, but they are, despite being different, they are very much linked. They use the same fonts, same templates. And same goes with the national team. They use the same fonts, templates, etc., as well. So as far as I can think of real quick right now, they are all treated the same.
Do you find it easier to find out missing information, to communicate with a club for women's football compared to men's?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find out missing information. Absolutely.
Cool.
It's just as easy as finding missing information as with the men's.
Thank you. And Laura, you mentioned that there are barriers to accessibility in women's football and in men's football. How do you think the women's game can learn from the men's game in terms of getting access and inclusion right?
Yo creo que ya por el hecho de que el fútbol masculino tenga muchos más trabajadores y mejores condiciones que el fútbol femenino, hace que también tengan más facilidades en cuanto a la comunicación a las personas con discapacidad. Pero sí que es verdad que para mí queda mucho trabajo tanto para el femenino como para el masculino.
Yeah. Thank you. Great, thank you. Perfect. I think that's a really good point to end on, that there is still a lot of work to do and lots that we can learn from and keep moving. And I think as we see this really exciting period of development in women's football, we'll all be following with a lot of interest to see the progress that is made for disabled fans' rights and access. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Baz and hearing more from V as the Euros and World Cup are coming up in the next couple of years. So unfortunately, that is all we have time for in this session. I want to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists and to all of you for tuning in. I am really excited to hand over to the next session, which will be chaired by Eleni Theodorou, and we'll look at collaboration with disability NGOs. So a huge thank you to everybody again, and I hope you really enjoy the rest of the conference over the coming day. So thank you, Laura, thank you, V, thank you, Baz. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.